No, let her go. Let her go, you fool, you fool, cried Ursula at the top of her voice, completely outside herself. And Gudrun hated her bitterly for being outside herself. It was unendurable that Ursula's voice was so powerful and naked. A sharpened look came on Gerald's face. He bit himself down on the mare like a keen edge biting home and forced her round. She roared as she breathed. Her nostrils were too wide, hot holes. Her mouth was apart, her eyes frenzied. It was a repulsive sight, but he held on her unrelaxed, with an almost mechanical relentlessness, keen as a sword pressing into her. Both man and horse were sweating with violence, yet he seemed calm as a ray of cold sunshine. Meanwhile, the eternal trucks were rumbling on, very slowly, treading one after the other, like a disgusting dream that has no end. The connecting chains were grinding and squeaking as the tension varied. The mare pawed and struck away mechanically now, her terror fulfilled in her, for now the man encompassed her. Her paws were blind and pathetic as she beat the air. The man closed round her and brought her down, almost as if she were part of his own physique. And she's bleeding, cried Ursula, frantic with opposition and hatred of Gerald. She alone understood him perfectly, in pure opposition. Gudrun looked and saw the trickles of blood on the sides of the mare, and she turned white. And then on the very wound the bright spurs came down, pressing relentlessly. The world reeled and passed into nothingness for Gudrun. She could not know any more. When she recovered, her soul was calm and cold, without feeling. The trucks were still rumbling by, and the man and the mare were still fighting. But she herself was cold and separate. She had no more feeling for them. She was quite hard and cold and indifferent. They could see the top of the hooded guard's van approaching. The sound of the trucks was diminishing. There was hope of relief from the intolerable noise. The heavy panting of the half-stunned mare sounded automatically. The man seemed to be relaxing confidently, his will bright and unstained. The guard's van came up and passed slowly, the guard staring out in his transition on the spectacle in the road. And through the man in the closed wagon, Gudrun could see the whole scene spectacularly, isolated and momentary, like a vision isolated in eternity. Lovely, grateful silence seemed to trail behind the receding train. How sweet the silence is. Ursula looked with hatred on the buffers of the diminishing wagon. The gatekeeper stood ready at the door of his hut to proceed to open the gate. But Gudrun sprang suddenly forward, in front of the struggling horse, threw off the latch and flung the gates asunder, throwing one half to the keeper and running with the other half, forwards. Gerald suddenly let go the horse and leaped forwards, almost onto Gudrun. She was not afraid. As he jerked aside the mare's head, Gudrun cried, in a strange, high voice, like a gull, or like a witch screaming out from the side of the road. "I should think you're proud." The words were distinct and formed. The man, twisting aside on his dancing horse, looked at her in some surprise, some wondering interest. Then the mare's hoofs had danced 3 times on the drum-like sleepers of the crossing, and man and horse were bounding springily, unequally up the road. The 2 girls watched them go. The gatekeeper hobbled thudding over the logs of the crossing with his wooden leg. He had fastened the gate. Then he also turned and called to the girls. A masterful young jockey, that. LL have his own road, if ever anybody would. Yes, cried Ursula, in her hot, overbearing voice. Why couldn't he take the horse away till the trucks had gone by? He's a fool and a bully. Does he think it's manly to torture a horse? It's a living thing. Why should he bully it and torture it? There was a pause. Then the gatekeeper shook his head and replied, "Yes, it's as nice a little mare as you could set eyes on. Beautiful little thing, beautiful. Now you couldn't see his father treat any animal like that, not you. They're as different as they welly can be, Gerald Critch and his father. 2 different men, different made." Then there was a pause. "But why does he do it?" cried Ursula. "Why does he? Does he think he's grand, when he's bullied a sensitive creature, 10 times as sensitive as himself?" Again there was a cautious pause. Then again the man shook his head, as if he would say nothing. but would think the more. "I expect he's got to train the mare to stand to anything," he replied. "A purebred Harab, not the sort of breed as is used around here. Different sort from our sort altogether. They say as he got her from Constantinople." "He would," said Ursula. "He'd better have left her to the Turks. I'm sure they would have had more decency towards her." The man went in to drink his kin of tea. The girls went on down the lane that was deep in soft black dust. Gudrun was as if numbed in her mind by the sense of indomitable soft weight of the man, bearing down into the living body of the horse, the strong, indomitable thighs of the blonde man clenching the palpitating body of the mare into pure control, a sort of soft white magnetic domination from the loins and thighs and calves, enclosing and encompassing the mare heavily into unutterable subordination. Soft blood subordination. Terrible. On the left, as the girls walked silently, the coal mine lifted its great mounds and its patterned headstocks. The black railway with the trucks at rest looked like a harbor just below, a large bay of railroad with anchored wagons. Near the second level crossing, that went over many bright rails, was a farm belonging to the collieries and a great round globe of iron, a disused boiler, huge and rusty and perfectly round, stood silently in a paddock by the road. The hens were pecking round it. Some chickens were balanced on the drinking trough. Wagtails flew away in among trucks from the water. On the other side of the wide crossing, by the roadside, was a heap of pale gray stones for mending the roads, and a cart standing, and a middle-aged man with whiskers round his face was leaning on his shovel, talking to a young man in gaiters, who stood by the horse's head. Both men were facing the crossing. They saw the two girls appear, small, brilliant figures in the near distance, in the strong light of the late afternoon. Both wore light, gay summer dresses. Ursula had an orange-colored knitted coat, Gudrun a pale yellow. Ursula wore canary yellow stockings, Gudrun bright rose. The figures of the two women seemed to glitter in progress over the wide bay of the railway crossing, white and orange and yellow and rose glittering in motion across a hot world silted with coal dust. The two men stood quite still in the heat, watching. The elder was a short, hard-faced, energetic man of middle age, the younger a laborer of 23 or so. They stood in silence, watching the advance of the sisters. They watched whilst the girls drew near, and whilst they passed, and whilst they receded down the dusty road, that had dwellings on one side, and dusty young corn on the other. Then the elder man, with the whiskers round his face, said in a prurient manner to the young man, "What price that, eh? She'll do, won't she?" "Which?" asked the young man, eagerly, with a laugh. "Her with the red stockings. What d'you say? I'd give my week's wages for 5 minutes." "What? Just for 5 minutes?" Again the young man laughed. "Your Mrs. Udy have summat to say to you," he replied. Gudrun had turned round and looked at the two men. They were to her sinister creatures, standing watching after her, by the heap of pale gray slag. She loathed the man with whiskers round his face. "You're first class, you are," the man said to her, and to the distance. "Do you think it would be worth a week's wages?" said the younger man, musing. "Do I? I'd put 'em bloody well down this second." The younger man looked after Gudrun and Ursula objectively, as if he wished to calculate what there might be that was worth his week's wages. He shook his head with fatal misgiving. "No," he said, "it's not worth that to me." "Isn't," said the old man. "By God, if it isn't to me." And he went on shoveling his stones. The girls descended between the houses with slate roofs and blackish brick walls. The heavy gold glamour of approaching sunset lay over all the colliery district, and the ugliness overlaid with beauty was like a narcotic to the senses. On the roads silted with black dust, the rich light fell more warmly, more heavily. Over all the amorphous squalor, a kind of magic was cast from the glowing close of day. "It has a foul kind of beauty, this place," said Gudrun, evidently suffering from fascination. "Can't you feel in some way a thick, hot attraction in it?" "I can, and it quite stupefies me." They were passing between blocks of miners' dwellings. In the backyards of several dwellings, a miner could be seen washing himself in the open on this hot evening, naked down to the loins, his great trousers of moleskin slipping almost away. Miners already cleaned were sitting on their heels, with their backs near the walls, talking and silent in pure physical well-being, tired and taking physical rest. Their voices sounded out with strong intonation, and the broad dialect was curiously caressing to the blood. It seemed to envelop Gudrun in a laborer's caress. There was in the whole atmosphere a resonance of physical men, a glamorous thickness of labor and maleness surcharged in the air. But it was universal in the district, and therefore unnoticed by the inhabitants. To Gudrun, however, it was potent and half repulsive. She could never tell why Beldover was so utterly different from London and the South, why one's whole feelings were different, why one seemed to live in another sphere. Now she realized that this was the world of powerful, underworld men who spent most of their time in the darkness. In their voices, she could hear the voluptuous resonance of darkness, the strong, dangerous underworld, mindless, inhuman. They sounded also like strange machines, heavy oiled. The voluptuousness was like that of machinery, cold and iron. It was the same every evening when she came home. She seemed to move through a wave of disruptive force that was given off from the presence of thousands of vigorous, underworld, half-automatized colliers, and which went to the brain and the heart, awaking a fatal desire and a fatal callousness. There came over her a nostalgia for the place. She hated it. She knew how utterly cut off it was, how hideous and how sickeningly mindless. Sometimes she beat her wings like a new Daphne, turning not into a tree, but a machine. And yet, she was overcome by the nostalgia. She struggled to get more and more into accord with the atmosphere of the place. She craved to get her satisfaction of it. She felt herself drawn out at evening into the main street of the town that was uncreated and ugly, and yet surcharged with this same potent atmosphere of intense, dark callousness. There were always miners about. They moved with their strange, distorted dignity, a certain beauty and unnatural stillness in their bearing, a look of abstraction and half-resignation in their pale, often gaunt faces. They belonged to another world. They had a strange glamour. Their voices were full of an intolerable deep resonance, like a machine's burring, a music more maddening than the sirens long ago. She found herself, with the rest of the common women, drawn out on Friday evenings to the little market. Friday was payday for the colliers, and Friday night was market night. Every woman was abroad. Every man was out, shopping with his wife, or gathering with his pals. The pavements were dark for miles around with people coming in, the little marketplace on the crown of the hill, and the main street of Beldover were black with thickly crowded men and women. It was dark. The marketplace was hot with kerosene flares, which threw a ruddy light on the grave faces of the purchasing wives and on the pale, abstract faces of the men. The air was full of the sound of criers and of people talking. Thick streams of people moved on the pavements towards the solid crowd of the market. The shops were blazing and packed with women. In the streets were men, mostly men, miners of all ages. Money was spent with almost lavish freedom. The carts that came could not pass through. They had to wait, the driver calling and shouting, till the dense crowd would make way. Everywhere, young fellows from the outlying districts were making conversation with the girls, standing in the road and at the corners. The doors of the public houses were open and full of light. Men passed in and out in a continual stream. Everywhere men were calling out to one another, or crossing to meet one another, or standing in little gangs and circles, discussing, endlessly discussing. The sense of talk, buzzing, jarring, half-secret, the endless mining and political wrangling, vibrated in the air like discordant machinery. And it was their voices which affected Gudrun almost to swooning. They aroused a strange, nostalgic ache of desire, something almost demoniacal, never to be fulfilled. Like any other common girl of the district, Gudrun strolled up and down the length of the brilliant 200 paces of the pavement nearest the marketplace. She knew it was a vulgar thing to do. Her father and mother could not bear it, but the nostalgia came over her. She must be among the people. Sometimes she sat among the louts in the cinema. Rakish-looking, unattractive louts they were, yet she must be among them. And, like any other common lass, she found her boy. It was an electrician, one of the electricians introduced according to Gerald's new scheme. He was an earnest, clever man, a scientist with a passion for sociology. He lived alone in a cottage in lodgings in Wiley Green. He was a gentleman, and sufficiently well-to-do. His landlady spread the reports about him. He would have a large wooden tub in his bedroom, and every time he came in from work, he would have pails and pails of water brought up to bathe in. Then he put on clean shirt and underclothing every day and clean silk socks. Fastidious and exacting he was in these respects, but in every other way, most ordinary and unassuming. Gudrun knew all these things. The Brangwens' house was one to which the gossip came naturally and inevitably. Palmer was in the first place a friend of Ursula's, but in his pale, elegant, serious face there showed the same nostalgia that Gudrun felt. He too must walk up and down the street on Friday evening. So he walked with Gudrun, and a friendship was struck up between them. But he was not in love with Gudrun. He really wanted Ursula, but for some strange reason, nothing could happen between her and him. He liked to have Gudrun about as a fellow mind, but that was all, and she had no real feeling for him. He was a scientist, he had to have a woman to back him. But he was really impersonal. He had the fineness of an elegant piece of machinery. He was too cold, too destructive to care really for women, too great an egoist. He was polarized by the men. Individually, he detested and despised them. In the mass, they fascinated him, as machinery fascinated him. They were a new sort of machinery to him, but incalculable. So Gudrun strolled the streets with Palmer, or went to the cinema with him, and his long, pale, rather elegant face flickered as he made his sarcastic remarks. There they were, the two of them, two elegants in one sense. In the other sense, two units absolutely adhering to the people, teeming with the distorted colliers. The same secret seemed to be working in the souls of all alike. Gudrun, Palmer, the rakish young bloods, the gaunt, middle-aged men. All had a secret sense of power and of inexpressible destructiveness and of fatal half-heartedness, a sort of rottenness in the will. Sometimes Gudrun would start aside, see it all, see how she was sinking in, and then she was filled with a fury of contempt and anger. She felt she was sinking into one mass with the rest, all so close and intermingled and breathless. It was horrible. She stifled. She prepared for flight. Feverishly, she flew to her work. But soon she let go. She started off into the country, the darkish, glamorous country. The spell was beginning to work again. X. Sketchbook. One morning the sisters were sketching by the side of Wiley Water at the remote end of the lake. Gudrun had waded out to a gravelly shoal and was seated like a Buddhist, staring fixedly at the water plants that rose succulent from the mud of the low shores. What she could see was mud, soft, oozy, watery mud, and from its festering chill, water plants rose up, thick and cool and fleshy, very straight and turgid, thrusting out their leaves at right angles, and having dark lurid colors, dark green and blotches of black purple and bronze. But she could feel their turgid fleshy structure as in a sensuous vision. She knew how they rose out of the mud. She knew how they thrust out from themselves, how they stood stiff and succulent against the air. Ursula was watching the butterflies, of which there were dozens near the water, little blue ones suddenly snapping out of nothingness into a jewel life, a large black and red one standing upon a flower and breathing with his soft wings, intoxicatingly, breathing pure, ethereal sunshine, two white ones wrestling in the low air. There was a halo round them. Ah, when they came tumbling nearer they were orange tips, and it was the orange that had made the halo. Ursula rose and drifted away, unconscious like the butterflies. Gudrun, absorbed in a stupor of apprehension of surging water plants, sat crouched on the shoal, drawing, not looking up for a long time, and then staring unconsciously, absorbedly at the rigid, naked, succulent stems. Her feet were bare. Her hat lay on the bank opposite. She started out of her trance, hearing the knocking of oars. She looked round. There was a boat with a gaudy Japanese parasol, and a man in white rowing. The woman was Hermione, and the man was Gerald. She knew it instantly, and instantly she perished in the keen frisson of anticipation, an electric vibration in her veins, intense, much more intense than that which was always humming low in the atmosphere of Beldover. Gerald was her escape from the heavy slough of the Pale, underworld, automatic colliers. He started out of the mud. He was master. She saw his back, the movement of his white loins. But not that. It was the whiteness he seemed to enclose as he bent forwards, rowing. He seemed to stoop to something. His glistening, whitish hair seemed like the electricity of the sky. "There's Gudrun," came Hermione's voice floating distinct over the water. "We will go and speak to her. Do you mind?" Gerald looked round and saw the girl standing by the water's edge, looking at him. He pulled the boat towards her, magnetically, without thinking of her. In his world, his conscious world, she was still nobody. He knew that Hermione had a curious pleasure in treading down all the social differences, at least apparently, and he left it to her. "How do you do, Gudrun?" sang Hermione, using the Christian name in the fashionable manner. "What are you doing?" "How do you do, Hermione?" "I was sketching." "Were you?" The boat drifted nearer, till the keel ground on the bank. "May we see? I should like to so much." It was no use resisting Hermione's deliberate intention. "Well," said Gudrun reluctantly, for she always hated to have her unfinished work exposed, "there's nothing in the least interesting." "Isn't there? But let me see. Will you?" Gudrun reached out the sketchbook. Gerald stretched from the boat to take it. And as he did so, he remembered Gudrun's last words to him, and her face lifted up to him as he sat on the swerving horse. An intensification of pride went over his nerves because he felt, in some way, she was compelled by him. The exchange of feeling between them was strong and apart from their consciousness. And as if in a spell, Gudrun was aware of his body, stretching and surging like the marsh fire, stretching toward her, his hand coming straight forward like a stem. Her voluptuous, acute apprehension of him made the blood faint in her veins. Her mind went dim and unconscious. And he rocked on the water perfectly, like the rocking of phosphorescence. He looked round at the boat. It was drifting off a little. He lifted the oar to bring it back, and the exquisite pleasure of slowly arresting the boat in the heavy soft water was complete as a swoon. "That's what you have done," said Hermione, looking searchingly at the plants on the shore and comparing with Gudrun's drawing. Gudrun looked round in the direction of Hermione's long, pointing finger. "That is it, isn't it?" repeated Hermione, needing confirmation. "Yes," said Gudrun automatically, taking no real heed. "Let me look," said Gerald, reaching forward for the book. But Hermione ignored him. He must not presume, before she had finished. But he, his will as unthwarted and as unflinching as hers, stretched forward till he touched the book. A little shock, a storm of revulsion against him, shook Hermione unconsciously. She released the book when he had not properly got it, and it tumbled against the side of the boat and bounced into the water. "There," sang Hermione, with a strange ring of malevolent victory. "I'm so sorry, so awfully sorry. Can't you get it, Gerald?" This last was said in a note of anxious sneering that made Gerald's veins tingle with fine hate for her. He leaned far out of the boat, reaching down into the water. He could feel his position was ridiculous, his loins exposed behind him. "It is of no importance," came the strong, clanging voice of Gudrun. She seemed to touch him, but he reached further. The boat swayed violently. Hermione, however, remained unperturbed. He grasped the book under the water and brought it up, dripping. "I'm so dreadfully sorry, repeated Hermione. "I'm afraid it was all my fault. It's of no importance, really, I assure you. It doesn't matter in the least," said Gudrun loudly, with emphasis, her face flushed scarlet. And she held out her hand impatiently for the wet book to have done with the scene. Gerald gave it to her. He was not quite himself. "I'm so dreadfully sorry," repeated Hermione, till both Gerald and Gudrun were exasperated. "Is there nothing that can be done?" "In what way?" asked Gudrun, with cool irony. "Can't we save the drawings?" There was a moment's pause, wherein Gudrun made evident all her refutation of Hermione's persistence. "I assure you," said Gudrun with cutting distinctness, "the drawings are quite as good as ever they were for my purpose. I want them only for reference. But can I give you a new book? I wish you'd let me do that. I feel so truly sorry. I feel it was all my fault." "As far as I saw," said Gudrun, "it wasn't your fault at all. If there was any fault, it was Mr. Critch's. But the whole thing is entirely trivial, and it really is ridiculous to take any notice of it." Gerald watched Gudrun closely, whilst she repulsed Hermione. There was a body of cold power in her. He watched her with an insight that amounted to clairvoyance. He saw her a dangerous, hostile spirit that could stand undiminished and unabated. It was so finished, and of such perfect gesture, moreover. "I'm awfully glad if it doesn't matter," he said, "if there's no real harm done." She looked back at him with her fine blue eyes and signaled full into his spirit, as she said, her voice ringing with intimacy, almost caressive now it was addressed to him. "Of course, it doesn't matter in the least." The bond was established between them, in that look, in her tone. In her tone, she made the understanding clear. They were of the same kind. He and she, a sort of diabolic freemasonry subsisted between them. Henceforward, she knew she had her power over him. Wherever they met, they would be secretly associated, and he would be helpless in the association with her. Her soul exulted. "Goodbye. I'm so glad you forgive me. Goodbye." Hermione sang her farewell and waved her hand. Gerald automatically took the oar and pushed off. But he was looking all the time with a glimmering, subtly smiling admiration in his eyes at Gudrun, who stood on the shoal shaking the wet book in her hand. She turned away and ignored the receding boat. But Gerald looked back as he rowed, beholding her, forgetting what he was doing. "Aren't we going too much to the left?" sang Hermione, as she sat ignored under her colored parasol. Gerald looked round without replying, the oars balanced and glancing in the sun. "I think it's all right," he said good-humoredly, beginning to row again without thinking of what he was doing. And Hermione disliked him extremely for his good-humored obliviousness. She was nullified. She could not regain ascendancy. 11. An island. Meanwhile, Ursula had wandered on from wily water along the course of the bright little stream. The afternoon was full of lark singing. On the bright hillsides was a subdued smolder of gorse. A few forget-me-nots flowered by the water. There was a rousedness and a glancing everywhere. She strayed absorbedly on, over the brooks. She wanted to go to the mill pond above. The big mill house was deserted, save for a laborer and his wife who lived in the kitchen. So she passed through the empty farmyard and through the wilderness of a garden and mounted the bank by the sluice. When she got to the top, to see the old, velvety surface of the pond before her, she noticed a man on the bank, tinkering with a punt. It was Birkin sawing and hammering away. She stood at the head of the sluice, looking at him. He was unaware of anybody's presence. He looked very busy, like a wild animal, active and intent. She felt she ought to go away. He would not want her. He seemed to be so much occupied, but she did not want to go away. Therefore she moved along the bank till he would look up, which he soon did. The moment he saw her, he dropped his tools and came forward, saying, "How do you do? I'm making the punt watertight. Tell me if you think it is right." She went along with him. "You are your father's daughter, so you can tell me if it will do," he said. She bent to look at the patched punt. "I am sure I am my father's daughter," she said, fearful of having to judge. "But I don't know anything about carpentry. It looks right, don't you think?" "Yes, I think. I hope it won't let me to the bottom, that's all. Though even so, it isn't a great matter. I should come up again. Help me to get it into the water, will you?" With combined efforts, they turned over the heavy punt and set it afloat. "Now," he said, "I'll try it, and you can watch what happens. Then if it carries, I'll take you over to the island." "Do," she cried, watching anxiously. The pond was large and had that perfect stillness and the dark luster of very deep water. There were 2 small islands overgrown with bushes and a few trees towards the middle. Birkin pushed himself off and veered clumsily in the pond. Luckily, the punt drifted so that he could catch hold of a willow bough and pull it to the island. "Rather overgrown," he said, looking into the interior, "but very nice. I'll come and fetch you. The boat leaks a little." In a moment he was with her again, and she stepped into the wet punt. "It'll float us all right," he said, and maneuvered again to the island. They landed under a willow tree. She shrank from the little jungle of rank plants before her, evil-smelling figwort and hemlock, but he explored into it. "I shall mow this down," he said, "and then it will be romantic, like Paul E.T. Virginie." "Yes, one could have lovely Watteau picnics here," cried Ursula with enthusiasm. His face darkened. "I don't want Watteau picnics here," he said. "Only your Virginie," she laughed. "Virginie enough," he smiled wryly. "No, I don't want her either." Ursula looked at him closely. She had not seen him since Bruttleby. He was very thin and hollow, with a ghastly look in his face. "You have been ill, haven't you?" she asked, rather repulsed. "Yes," he replied coldly. They had sat down under the willow tree and were looking at the pond from their retreat on the island. "Has it made you frightened?" she asked. "What of?" he asked, turning his eyes to look at her. Something in him, inhuman and unmitigated, disturbed her and shook her out of her ordinary self. "It is frightening to be very ill, isn't it?" she said. "It isn't pleasant," he said. "Whether one is really afraid of death or not, I have never decided. In one mood, not a bit, in another, very much." "But doesn't it make you feel ashamed?" "I think it makes one so ashamed to be ill. Illness is so terribly humiliating, don't you think?" He considered for some minutes. "Maybe," he said, "though one knows all the time one's life isn't really right at the source. That's the humiliation. I don't see that the illness counts so much after that. One is ill because one doesn't live properly, can't. It's the failure to live that makes one ill and humiliates one." "But do you fail to live?" she asked, almost jeering. "Why, yes. I don't make much of a success of my days. One seems always to be bumping one's nose against the blank wall ahead." Ursula laughed. She was frightened, and when she was frightened, she always laughed and pretended to be Johnny. "Your poor nose," she said, looking at that feature of his face. "No wonder it's ugly," he replied. She was silent for some minutes, struggling with her own self-deception. It was an instinct in her to deceive herself. "But I'm happy. I think life is awfully jolly," she said. "Good," he answered, with a certain cold indifference. She reached for a bit of paper which had wrapped a small piece of chocolate she had found in her pocket, and began making a boat. He watched her without heeding her. There was something strangely pathetic and tender in her moving, unconscious fingertips that were agitated and hurt, really. "I do enjoy things, don't you?" she asked. "Oh, yes. But it infuriates me that I can't get right at the really growing part of me. I feel all tangled and messed up, and I can't get straight anyhow. I don't know what really to do. One must do something somewhere." "Why should you always be doing?" she retorted. "It is so plebeian. I think it is much better to be really patrician and to do nothing but just be oneself like a walking flower." "I quite agree," he said, "if one has burst into blossom. But I can't get my flower to blossom anyhow. Either it is blighted in the bud, or has got the smother fly, or it isn't nourished. Curse it, it isn't even a bud. It is a contravened knot." Again she laughed. He was so very fretful and exasperated. But she was anxious and puzzled. How was one to get out anyhow? There must be a way out somewhere. There was a silence, wherein she wanted to cry. She reached for another bit of chocolate paper and began to fold another boat. "And why is it," she asked at length, "that there is no flowering, no dignity of human life now? The whole idea is dead. Humanity itself is dry-rotten, really. There are myriads of human beings hanging on the bush, and they look very nice and rosy, your healthy young men and women. But they are apples of Sodom, as a matter of fact, Dead Sea fruit gall apples. It isn't true that they have any significance. Their insides are full of bitter, corrupt ash." "But there are good people," protested Ursula. "Good enough for the life of today. But mankind is a dead tree, covered with fine, brilliant galls of people. Ursula could not help stiffening herself against this. It was too picturesque and final. But neither could she help making him go on. And if it is so, why is it? She asked, hostile. They were rousing each other to a fine passion of opposition. Why are people all balls of bitter dust? Because they won't fall off the tree when they're ripe. They hang on to their old positions when the position is overpassed, till they become infested with little worms and dry rot. There was a long pause. His voice had become hot and very sarcastic. Ursula was troubled and bewildered. They were both oblivious of everything but their own immersion. But even if everybody is wrong, where are you right? She cried. Where are you any better? I'm not right, he cried back. At least my only rightness lies in the fact that I know it. I detest what I am outwardly. I loathe myself as a human being. Humanity is a huge aggregate lie, and a huge lie is less than a small truth. Humanity is less, far less than the individual, because the individual may sometimes be capable of truth, and humanity is a tree of lies. And they say that love is the greatest thing. They persist in saying this, the foul liars, and just look at what they do. Look at all the millions of people who repeat every minute that love is the greatest, and charity is the greatest, and see what they are doing all the time. By their works ye shall know them, for dirty liars and cowards, who daren't stand by their own actions, much less by their own words. But, said Ursula sadly, that doesn't alter the fact that love is the greatest, does it? What they do doesn't alter the truth of what they say, does it? Completely, because if what they say were true, then they couldn't help fulfilling it. But they maintain a lie, and so they run amok at last. It's a lie to say that love is the greatest. You might as well say that hate is the greatest, since the opposite of everything balances. What people want is hate. Hate and nothing but hate. And in the name of righteousness and love, they get it. They distill themselves with nitroglycerin, all the lot of them, out of very love. It's the lie that kills. If we want hate, let us have it. Death, murder, torture, violent destruction, let us have it. But not in the name of love. But I abhor humanity. I wish it was swept away. It could go, and there would be no absolute loss if every human being perished tomorrow. The reality would be untouched. Nay, it would be better. The real tree of life would then be rid of the most ghastly, heavy crop of dead sea fruit, the intolerable burden of myriad simulacra of people, and infinite weight of mortal lies. So you'd like everybody in the world destroyed? Said Ursula. I should indeed. And the world empty of people? Yes, truly. You yourself, don't you find it a beautiful, clean thought? A world empty of people, just uninterrupted grass, and a hair sitting up. The pleasant sincerity of his voice made Ursula pause to consider her own proposition. And really it was attractive. A clean, lovely, humanless world. It was the really desirable. Her heart hesitated and exulted. But still, she was dissatisfied with him. But, she objected, you be dead yourself, so what good would it do you? I would die like a shot, to know that the earth would really be cleaned of all the people. It is the most beautiful and freeing thought. Then there would never be another foul humanity created for a universal defilement. No, said Ursula, there would be nothing. What? Nothing? Just because humanity was wiped out? You flatter yourself. There'd be everything. But how if there were no people? Do you think that creation depends on man? It merely doesn't. There are the trees and the grass and birds. I much prefer to think of the lark rising up in the morning upon a humanless world. Man is a mistake, he must go. There is the grass and hares and adders and the unseen hosts, actual angels that go about freely when a dirty humanity doesn't interrupt them, and good pure-tissued demons. Very nice. It pleased Ursula. What he said pleased her very much, as a fantasy. Of course it was only a pleasant fancy. She herself knew too well the actuality of humanity, its hideous actuality. She knew it could not disappear so cleanly and conveniently. It had a long way to go yet, a long and hideous way. Her subtle, feminine, demoniacal soul knew it well. If only man was swept off the face of the earth, creation would go on so marvelously, with a new start, non-human. Man is one of the mistakes of creation, like the ichthyosauri. If only he were gone again, think what lovely things would come out of the liberated days, things straight out of the fire. But man will never be gone, she said, with insidious, diabolical knowledge of the horrors of persistence. The world will go with him. "Ah, no," he answered. "Not so. I believe in the proud angels and the demons that are our forerunners. They will destroy us, because we are not proud enough." The ichthyosauri were not proud. They crawled and floundered as we do. And besides, look at elderflowers and bluebells. They are a sign that pure creation takes place, even the butterfly. But humanity never gets beyond the caterpillar stage. It rots in the chrysalis. It never will have wings. It is anti-creation, like monkeys and baboons. Ursula watched him as he talked. There seemed a certain impatient fury in him, all the while, and at the same time a great amusement in everything and a final tolerance. And it was this tolerance she mistrusted, not the fury. She saw that, all the while, in spite of himself, he would have to be trying to save the world. And this knowledge, whilst it comforted her heart somewhere with a little self-satisfaction, stability, yet filled her with a certain sharp contempt and hate of him. She wanted him to herself. She hated the Solvitor Mundi touch. It was something diffuse and generalized about him, which she could not stand. He would behave in the same way, say the same things, give himself as completely to anybody who came along, anybody and everybody who liked to appeal to him. It was despicable, a very insidious form of prostitution. "But," she said, "you believe in individual love, even if you don't believe in loving humanity." "I don't believe in love at all, that is, any more than I believe in hate or in grief. Love is one of the emotions like all the others, and so it is all right whilst you feel it. But I can't see how it becomes an absolute. It is just part of human relationships, no more. And it is only part of any human relationship. And why one should be required always to feel it, any more than one always feels sorrow or distant joy, I cannot conceive. Love isn't a desideratum. It is an emotion you feel or you don't feel, according to circumstance." "Then why do you care about people at all?" she asked. "If you don't believe in love, why do you bother about humanity?" "Why do I? Because I can't get away from it." "Because you love it," she persisted. It irritated him. "If I do love it," he said, "it is my disease." "But it is a disease you don't want to be cured of," she said, with some cold sneering. He was silent now, feeling she wanted to insult him. "And if you don't believe in love, what do you believe in?" she asked, mocking. "Simply in the end of the world and grass?" He was beginning to feel a fool. "I believe in the unseen hosts," he said. "And nothing else? You believe in nothing visible, except grass and birds? Your world is a poor show." "Perhaps it is," he said, cool and superior. Now he was offended, assuming a certain insufferable aloof superiority and withdrawing into his distance. Ursula disliked him, but also she felt she had lost something. She looked at him as he sat crouched on the bank. There was a certain priggish Sunday school stiffness over him, priggish and detestable. And yet, at the same time, the molding of him was so quick and attractive, it gave such a great sense of freedom. The molding of his brows, his chin, his whole physique, something so alive, somewhere, in spite of the look of sickness. And it was this duality in feeling which he created in her that made a fine hate of him quicken in her bowels. There was his wonderful, desirable life rapidity, the rare quality of an utterly desirable man. And there was at the same time this ridiculous, mean effacement into a Solvitor Mundi and a Sunday school teacher, a prig of the stiffest type. He looked up at her. He saw her face strangely enkindled, as if suffused from within by a powerful, sweet fire. His soul was arrested in wonder. She was enkindled in her own living fire, arrested in wonder and in pure, perfect attraction. He moved towards her. She sat like a strange queen, almost supernatural in her glowing, smiling richness. "The point about love," he said, his consciousness quickly adjusting itself, "is that we hate the word because we have vulgarised it. It ought to be prescribed, tabooed from utterance for many years, till we get a new, better idea. There was a beam of understanding between them. But it always means the same thing, she said. Oh God, no, let it not mean that anymore, he cried. Let the old meanings go. But still it is love, she persisted. A strange, wicked yellow light shone at him in her eyes. He hesitated, baffled, withdrawing. No, he said. It isn't. Spoken like that, never in the world. You've no business to utter the word. I must leave it to you, to take it out of the Ark of the Covenant at the right moment, she mocked. Again they looked at each other. She suddenly sprang up, turned her back to him, and walked away. He too rose slowly and went to the water's edge, where, crouching, he began to amuse himself unconsciously. Picking a daisy, he dropped it on the pond, so that the stem was a keel. The flower floated like a little water lily, staring with its open face up to the sky. It turned slowly round, in a slow dervish dance, as it veered away. He watched it, then dropped another daisy into the water, and after that another, and sat watching them with bright, absolved eyes, crouching near on the bank. Ursula turned to look. A strange feeling possessed her, as if something were taking place. But it was all intangible, and some sort of control was being put on her. She could not know. She could only watch the brilliant little discs of the daisies veering slowly in travel on the dark, lustrous water. The little flotilla was drifting into the light, a company of white specks in the distance. Do let us go to the shore, to follow them, she said, afraid of being any longer imprisoned on the island. And they pushed off in the punt. She was glad to be on the free land again. She went along the bank towards the sluice. The daisies were scattered broadcast on the pond, tiny radiant things, like an exaltation, points of exaltation here and there. Why did they move her so strongly and mystically? Look, he said, your boat of purple paper is escorting them, and they are a convoy of rafts. Some of the daisies came slowly towards her, hesitating, making a shy bright little cotillion on the dark, clear water. Their gay bright candor moved her so much as they came near that she was almost in tears. Why are they so lovely? She cried. Why do I think them so lovely? They are nice flowers, he said, her emotional tones putting a constraint on him. You know that a daisy is a company of florets, a concourse, become individual. Don't the botanists put it highest in the line of development? I believe they do. The composite, yes, I think so, said Ursula, who was never very sure of anything. Things she knew perfectly well, at one moment, seemed to become doubtful the next. Explain it so, then, he said. The daisy is a perfect little democracy, so it's the highest of flowers, hence its charm. No, she cried. No, never. It isn't democratic. No, he admitted. It's the golden mob of the proletariat, surrounded by a showy white fence of the idle rich. How hateful, your hateful social orders, she cried. Quite. It's a daisy. We'll leave it alone. Do. Let it be a dark horse for once, she said. If anything can be a dark horse to you, she added satirically. They stood aside, forgetful. As if a little stunned, they both were motionless, barely conscious. The little conflict into which they had fallen had torn their consciousness and left them like two impersonal forces, there in contact. He became aware of the lapse. He wanted to say something, to get on to a new, more ordinary footing. You know, he said, that I am having rooms here at the mill? Don't you think we can have some good times? Oh, are you, she said, ignoring all his implication of admitted intimacy. He adjusted himself at once, became normally distant. If I find I can live sufficiently by myself, he continued, I shall give up my work altogether. It has become dead to me. I don't believe in the humanity I pretend to be part of. I don't care a straw for the social ideals I live by. I hate the dying organic form of social mankind. So it can't be anything but trumpery to work at education. I shall drop it as soon as I am clear enough, tomorrow perhaps, and be by myself. Have you enough to live on? Asked Ursula. Yes, I've about 400 a year. That makes it easy for me. There was a pause. And what about Hermione? Asked Ursula. That's over, finally. A pure failure, and never could have been anything else. But you still know each other? We could hardly pretend to be strangers, could we? There was a stubborn pause. But isn't that a half measure? Asked Ursula at length. I don't think so, he said. You'll be able to tell me if it is. Again there was a pause of some minutes' duration. He was thinking. One must throw everything away, everything, let everything go, to get the one last thing one wants, he said. What thing? She asked in challenge. I don't know, freedom together, he said. She had wanted him to say love. There was heard a loud barking of the dogs below. He seemed disturbed by it. She did not notice. Only she thought he seemed uneasy. As a matter of fact, he said in rather a small voice, I believe that is Hermione come now, with Gerald Critch. She wanted to see the rooms before they are furnished. I know, said Ursula. She will superintend the furnishing for you. Probably. Does it matter? Oh no, I should think not, said Ursula. Though personally, I can't bear her. I think she is a lie, if you like, you who are always talking about lies. Then she ruminated for a moment when she broke out. Yes, and I do mind if she furnishes your rooms. I do mind. I mind that you keep her hanging on at all. He was silent now, frowning. Perhaps, he said. I don't want her to furnish the rooms here, and I don't keep her hanging on. Only I needn't be churlish to her, need I? At any rate, I shall have to go down and see them now. You'll come, won't you? I don't think so, she said coldly and irresolutely. Won't you? Yes, do. Come and see the rooms as well. Do come. 12. Carpeting. He set off down the bank, and she went unwillingly with him. Yet she would not have stayed away either. We know each other well, you and I already, he said. She did not answer. In the large darkish kitchen of the mill, the laborer's wife was talking shrilly to Hermione and Gerald, who stood, he in white and she in a glistening bluish foulard, strangely luminous in the dusk of the room, whilst from the cages on the walls, a dozen or more canaries sang at the top of their voices. The cages were all placed round a small square window at the back, where the sunshine came in, a beautiful beam, filtering through green leaves of a tree. The voice of Mrs. Salmon shrilled against the noise of the birds, which rose ever more wild and triumphant, and the woman's voice went up and up against them, and the birds replied with wild animation. Here's Rupert, shouted Gerald in the midst of the din. He was suffering badly, being very sensitive in the ear. Oh, them birds, they won't let you speak, shrilled the laborer's wife in disgust. I'll cover them up. And she darted here and there, throwing a duster, an apron, a towel, a tablecloth over the cages of the birds. Now will you stop it, and let a body speak for your row, she said, still in a voice that was too high. The party watched her. Soon the cages were covered. They had a strange, funereal look. But from under the towels odd defiant trills and bubblings still shook out. Oh, they won't go on, said Mrs. Salmon reassuringly. They'll go to sleep now. Really, said Hermione politely. They will, said Gerald. They will go to sleep automatically. Now the impression of evening is produced. Are they so easily deceived? Cried Ursula. Oh, yes, replied Gerald. Don't you know the story of Fabre, who, when he was a boy, put a hen's head under her wing, and she straightway went to sleep? It's quite true. And did that make him a naturalist? Asked Birkin. Probably, said Gerald. Meanwhile, Ursula was peeping under one of the cloths. There sat the canary in a corner, bunched and fluffed up for sleep. How ridiculous, she cried. It really thinks the night has come. How absurd. Really, how can one have any respect for a creature that is so easily taken in? Yes, sang Hermione, coming also to look. She put her hand on Ursula's arm and chuckled a low laugh. Yes, doesn't he look comical? She chuckled. Like a stupid husband. Then, with her hand still on Ursula's arm, she drew her away, saying, in her mild sing-song, How did you come here? We saw Gudrun too. I came to look at the pond, said Ursula, and I found Mr. Birkin there. Did you? This is quite a Brangwen land, isn't it? I'm afraid I hope so, said Ursula. I ran here for refuge when I saw you down the lake, just putting off. Did you? And now we've run you to earth. Hermione's eyelids lifted with an uncanny movement, amused but overwrought. She had always her strange, rapt look, unnatural and irresponsible. "I was going on," said Ursula. "Mr. Birkin wanted me to see the rooms. Isn't it delightful to live here? It is perfect." "Yes," said Hermione, abstractedly. Then she turned right away from Ursula, ceased to know her existence. "How do you feel, Rupert?" she sang in a new, affectionate tone to Birkin. "Very well," he replied. "Were you quite comfortable?" The curious, sinister, rapt look was on Hermione's face. She shrugged her bosom in a convulsed movement and seemed like one half in a trance. "Quite comfortable," he replied. There was a long pause, whilst Hermione looked at him for a long time from under her heavy, drugged eyelids. "And you think you'll be happy here?" she said at last. "I'm sure I shall. I'm sure I shall do anything for him as I can," said the laborer's wife. "And I'm sure our master will, so I hope he'll find himself comfortable." Hermione turned and looked at her slowly. "Thank you so much," she said, and then she turned completely away again. She recovered her position and lifting her face towards him and addressing him exclusively, she said, "Have you measured the rooms?" "No," he said. "I've been mending the punt." "Shall we do it now?" she said slowly, balanced and dispassionate. "Have you got a tape measure, Mrs. Salmon?" he said, turning to the woman. "Yes, sir. I think I can find one," replied the woman, bustling immediately to a basket. "This is the only one I've got, if it will do." Hermione took it, though it was offered to him. "Thank you so much," she said. "It will do very nicely. Thank you so much." Then she turned to Birkin, saying with a little gay movement, "Shall we do it now, Rupert?" "What about the others? They'll be bored," he said reluctantly. "Do you mind?" said Hermione, turning to Ursula and Gerald vaguely. "Not in the least," they replied. "Which room shall we do first?" she said, turning again to Birkin, with the same gaiety. Now she was going to do something with him. "We'll take them as they come," he said. "Should I be getting your teas ready?" "While you do that," said the laborer's wife, also gay, because she had something to do. "Would you?" said Hermione, turning to her with the curious motion of intimacy that seemed to envelop the woman, draw her almost to Hermione's breast, and which left the others standing apart. "I should be so glad. Where shall we have it? Where would you like it? Shall it be in here, or out on the grass?" "Where shall we have tea?" sang Hermione to the company at large. "On the bank by the pond. And we'll carry the things up if you'll just get them ready, Mrs. Salmon," said Birkin. "All right," said the pleased woman. The party moved down the passage into the front room. It was empty, but clean and sunny. There was a window looking on to the tangled front garden. "This is the dining room," said Hermione. "We'll measure it this way, Rupert. You go down there." "Can I do it for you?" said Gerald, coming to take the end of the tape. "No, thank you," cried Hermione, stooping to the ground in her bluish, brilliant foulard. It was a great joy to her to do things, and to have the ordering of the job with Birkin. He obeyed her subduedly. Ursula and Gerald looked on. It was a peculiarity of Hermione's that at every moment she had one intimate and turned all the rest of those present into onlookers. This raised her into a state of triumph. They measured and discussed in the dining room, and Hermione decided what the floor coverings must be. It sent her into a strange, convulsed anger to be thwarted. Birkin always let her have her way, for the moment. Then they moved across through the hall to the other front room that was a little smaller than the first. "This is the study," said Hermione. "Rupert, I have a rug that I want you to have for here. Will you let me give it to you?" "Do, I want to give it you." "What is it like?" he asked ungraciously. "You haven't seen it. It is chiefly rose red, then blue, a metallic mid-blue, and a very soft dark blue. I think you would like it. Do you think you would?" "It sounds very nice," he replied. "What is it? Oriental? With a pile?" "Yes." "Persian. It is made of camel's hair, silky. I think it is called Bergamos 12 feet by 7. Do you think it will do?" "It would do," he said. "But why should you give me an expensive rug? I can manage perfectly well with my old Oxford Turkish." "But may I give it to you?" Do let me. How much did it cost? She looked at him and said, I don't remember. It was quite cheap. He looked at her, his face set. I don't want to take it, Hermione, he said. Do let me give it to the rooms, she said, going up to him and putting her hand on his arm lightly, pleadingly. I shall be so disappointed. You know I don't want you to give me things, he repeated helplessly. I don't want to give you things, she said teasingly. But will you have this? All right, he said, defeated, and she triumphed. They went upstairs. There were 2 bedrooms to correspond with the rooms downstairs. One of them was half furnished, and Birkin had evidently slept there. Hermione went round the room carefully, taking in every detail, as if absorbing the evidence of his presence in all the inanimate things. She felt the bed and examined the coverings. Are you sure you were quite comfortable? She said, pressing the pillow. Perfectly, he replied coldly. And were you warm? There is no down quilt. I am sure you need one. You mustn't have a great pressure of clothes. I've got one, he said. It is coming down. They measured the rooms and lingered over every consideration. Ursula stood at the window and watched the woman carrying the tea up the bank to the pond. She hated the palaver Hermione made. She wanted to drink tea. She wanted anything but this fuss and business. At last, they all mounted the grassy bank to the picnic. Hermione poured out tea. She ignored now Ursula's presence. And Ursula, recovering from her ill humor, turned to Gerald saying, Oh, I hated you so much the other day, Mr. Critch. What for? Said Gerald, wincing slightly away. For treating your horse so badly. Oh, I hated you so much. What did he do? Sang Hermione. He made his lovely, sensitive Arab horse stand with him at the railway crossing whilst a horrible lot of trucks went by, and the poor thing, she was in a perfect frenzy, a perfect agony. It was the most horrible sight you can imagine. Why did you do it, Gerald? Asked Hermione, calm and interrogative. She must learn to stand. What use is she to me in this country, if she shies and goes off every time an engine whistles? But why inflict unnecessary torture? Said Ursula. Why make her stand all that time at the crossing? You might just as well have ridden back up the road and saved all that horror. Her sides were bleeding where you had spurred her. It was too horrible. Gerald stiffened. I have to use her, he replied. And if I'm going to be sure of her at all, she'll have to learn to stand noises. Why should she? Cried Ursula in a passion. She is a living creature. Why should she stand anything? Just because you choose to make her? She has as much right to her own being as you have to yours. There I disagree, said Gerald. I consider that Mare is there for my use, not because I bought her, but because that is the natural order. It is more natural for a man to take a horse and use it as he likes, than for him to go down on his knees to it, begging it to do as it wishes, and to fulfill its own marvelous nature. Ursula was just breaking out when Hermione lifted her face and began, in her musing sing-song, I do really think we must have the courage to use the lower animal life for our needs. I do think there is something wrong when we look on every living creature as if it were ourselves. I do feel that it is false to project our own feelings on every animate creature. It is a lack of discrimination, a lack of criticism. Quite, said Birkin sharply. Nothing is so detestable as the maudlin attributing of human feelings and consciousness to animals. Yes, said Hermione wearily, we must really take a position. Either we are going to use the animals or they will use us. That's a fact, said Gerald. A horse has got a will like a man, though it has no mind strictly. And if your will isn't master, then the horse is master of you. And this is a thing I can't help. I can't help being master of the horse. If only we could learn how to use our will, said Hermione. We could do anything. The will can cure anything and put anything right. That I am convinced of, if only we use the will properly, intelligibly. What do you mean by using the will properly? Said Birkin. A very great doctor taught me, she said, addressing Ursula and Gerald vaguely. He told me, for instance, that to cure oneself of a bad habit, one should force oneself to do it. When one would not do it, make oneself do it, and then the habit would disappear. How do you mean? Said Gerald. If you bite your nails, for example. Then, when you don't want to bite your nails, bite them, make yourself bite them, and you would find the habit was broken. Is that so? Said Gerald. Yes, and in so many things, I have made myself well. I was a very queer and nervous girl, and by learning to use my will, simply by using my will, I made myself right. Ursula looked all the while at Hermione as she spoke in her slow, dispassionate, and yet strangely tense voice. A curious thrill went over the younger woman. Some strange, dark, convulsive power was in Hermione, fascinating and repelling. It is fatal to use the will like that, cried Birkin harshly. Disgusting. Such a will is an obscenity. Hermione looked at him for a long time with her shadowed, heavy eyes. Her face was soft and pale and thin, almost phosphorescent. Her jaw was lean. I'm sure it isn't, she said at length. There always seemed an interval, a strange split between what she seemed to feel and experience and what she actually said and thought. She seemed to catch her thoughts at length from off the surface of a maelstrom of chaotic black emotions and reactions, and Birkin was always filled with repulsion. She caught so infallibly, her will never failed her. Her voice was always dispassionate and tense, and perfectly confident. Yet she shuddered with a sense of nausea, a sort of seasickness that always threatened to overwhelm her mind. But her mind remained unbroken. Her will was still perfect. It almost sent Birkin mad. But he would never dare to break her will and let loose the maelstrom of her subconsciousness and see her in her ultimate madness. Yet he was always striking at her. And of course, he said to Gerald, horses haven't got a complete will, like human beings. A horse has no one will. Every horse, strictly, has two wills. With one will, it wants to put itself in the human power completely, and with the other, it wants to be free, wild. The two wills sometimes lock. You know that if ever you've felt a horse bolt while you've been driving it. I have felt a horse bolt while I was driving it, said Gerald, but it didn't make me know it had two wills. I only knew it was frightened. Hermione had ceased to listen. She simply became oblivious when these subjects were started. Why should a horse want to put itself in the human power? Asked Ursula. That is quite incomprehensible to me. I don't believe it ever wanted it. Yes, it did. It's the last, perhaps highest, love impulse. Resign your will to the higher being, said Birkin. What curious notions you have of love, jeered Ursula. And woman is the same as horses. Two wills act in opposition inside her. With one will, she wants to subject herself utterly. With the other, she wants to bolt and pitch her rider to perdition. Then I'm a bolter, said Ursula, with a burst of laughter. It's a dangerous thing to domesticate even horses, let alone women, said Birkin. The dominant principle has some rare antagonists. Good thing too, said Ursula. Quite, said Gerald, with a faint smile. There's more fun. Hermione could bear no more. She rose, saying in her easy sing-song, Isn't the evening beautiful? I get filled sometimes with such a great sense of beauty that I feel I can hardly bear it. Ursula, to whom she had appealed, rose with her, moved to the last impersonal depths, and Birkin seemed to her almost a monster of hateful arrogance. She went with Hermione along the bank of the pond, talking of beautiful, soothing things, picking the gentle cowslips. Wouldn't you like a dress? Said Ursula to Hermione. Of this yellow spotted with orange. A cotton dress? Yes, said Hermione, stopping and looking at the flower, letting the thought come home to her and soothe her. Wouldn't it be pretty? I should love it. And she turned smiling to Ursula, in a feeling of real affection. But Gerald remained with Birkin, wanting to probe him to the bottom, to know what he meant by the dual will in horses. A flicker of excitement danced on Gerald's face. Hermione and Ursula strayed on together, united in a sudden bond of deep affection and closeness. I really do not want to be forced into all this criticism and analysis of life. I really do want to see things in their entirety, with their beauty left to them, and their wholeness, their natural holiness. Don't you feel it? Don't you feel you can't be tortured into any more knowledge? Said Hermione, stopping in front of Ursula and turning to her with clenched fists thrust downwards. "Yes," said Ursula. "I do. I am sick of all this poking and prying." "I'm so glad you are." "Sometimes," said Hermione, again stopping arrested in her progress and turning to Ursula, "sometimes I wonder if I ought to submit to all this realization, if I am not being weak in rejecting it. But I feel I can't. It seems to destroy everything. All the beauty and the true holiness is destroyed, and I feel I can't live without them." "And it would be simply wrong to live without them," cried Ursula. "No, it is so irreverent to think that everything must be realized in the head. Really, something must be left to the Lord. There always is and always will be." "Yes," said Hermione, reassured like a child. "It should, shouldn't it? And Rupert," she lifted her face to the sky in a muse, "he can only tear things to pieces. He really is like a boy who must pull everything to pieces to see how it is made. And I can't think it is right. It does seem so irreverent, as you say." "Like tearing open a bud to see what the flower will be like," said Ursula. "Yes, and that kills everything, doesn't it? It doesn't allow any possibility of flowering." "Of course not," said Ursula. "It is purely destructive." "It is, isn't it?" Hermione looked long and slow at Ursula, seeming to accept confirmation from her. Then the two women were silent. As soon as they were in accord, they began mutually to mistrust each other. In spite of herself, Ursula felt herself recoiling from Hermione. It was all she could do to restrain her revulsion. They returned to the men, like two conspirators who have withdrawn to come to an agreement. Birkin looked up at them. Ursula hated him for his cold watchfulness, but he said nothing. "Shall we be going?" said Hermione. "Rupert, you are coming to Shortlands to dinner? Will you come at once? Will you come now, with us?" "I'm not dressed," replied Birkin. "And, you know, Gerald stickles for convention." "I don't stickle for it," said Gerald. "But if you got as sick as I have of rowdy go-as-you-please in the house, you prefer it if people were peaceful and conventional, at least at meals." "All right," said Birkin. "But can't we wait for you while you dress?" persisted Hermione. "If you like." He rose to go indoors. Ursula said she would take her leave. "Only," she said, turning to Gerald, "I must say that, however man is lord of the beast and the fowl, I still don't think he has any right to violate the feelings of the inferior creation. I still think it would have been much more sensible and nice of you if you'd trotted back up the road while the train went by and been considerate." "I see," said Gerald, smiling, but somewhat annoyed. "I must remember another time." "They all think I'm an interfering female," thought Ursula to herself as she went away. But she was in arms against them. She ran home plunged in thought. She had been very much moved by Hermione. She had really come into contact with her so that there was a sort of league between the two women. And yet she could not bear her. But she put the thought away. "She's really good," she said to herself. "She really wants what is right." And she tried to feel at one with Hermione and to shut off from Birkin. She was strictly hostile to him, but she was held to him by some bond, some deep principle. This at once irritated her and saved her. Only now and again, violent little shudders would come over her, out of her subconsciousness, and she knew it was the fact that she had stated her challenge to Birkin, and he had, consciously or unconsciously, accepted. It was a fight to the death between them, or to new life, though in what the conflict lay, no one could say. 13. Mino. The days went by, and she received no sign. Was he going to ignore her? Was he going to take no further notice of her secret? A dreary weight of anxiety and acrid bitterness settled on her. And yet Ursula knew she was only deceiving herself, and that he would proceed. She said no word to anybody. Then, sure enough, there came a note from him, asking if she would come to tea with Gudrun, to his rooms in town. Why does he ask Gudrun as well? She asked herself at once. Does he want to protect himself? Or does he think I would not go alone? She was tormented by the thought that he wanted to protect himself. But at the end of all, she only said to herself, I don't want Gudrun to be there because I want him to say something more to me. So I shan't tell Gudrun anything about it, and I shall go alone. Then I shall know. She found herself sitting on the tramcar, mounting up the hill going out of the town, to the place where he had his lodging. She seemed to have passed into a kind of dream world, absolved from the conditions of actuality. She watched the sordid streets of the town go by beneath her, as if she were a spirit disconnected from the material universe. What had it all to do with her? She was palpitating and formless within the flux of the ghost life. She could not consider any more what anybody would say of her or think about her. People had passed out of her range. She was absolved. She had fallen strange and dim, out of the sheath of the material life, as a berry falls from the only world it has ever known, down out of the sheath onto the real unknown. Buchan was standing in the middle of the room when she was shown in by the landlady. He too was moved outside himself. She saw him agitated and shaken, a frail, unsubstantial body silent like the node of some violent force that came out from him and shook her almost into a swoon. "You are alone," he said. Yes, Gudrun could not come. He instantly guessed why, and they were both seated in silence, in the terrible tension of the room. She was aware that it was a pleasant room, full of light and very restful in its form, aware also of a fuchsia tree with dangling scarlet and purple flowers. "How nice the fuchsias are," she said, to break the silence. "Aren't they? Did you think I had forgotten what I said?" A swoon went over Ursula's mind. "I don't want you to remember it if you don't want to," she struggled to say, through the dark mist that covered her. There was silence for some moments.
"No," he said.
"It isn't that. Only if we are going to know each other, we must pledge ourselves forever. If we are going to make a relationship, even a friendship, there must be something final and infallible about it." There was a clang of mistrust and almost anger in his voice. She did not answer. Her heart was too much contracted. She could not have spoken. Seeing she was not going to reply, he continued, almost bitterly, giving himself away. "I can't say it is love I have to offer, and it isn't love I want. It is something much more impersonal and harder and rarer." There was a silence, out of which she said, "You mean you don't love me?" She suffered furiously, saying that. "Yes, if you like to put it like that. Though perhaps that isn't true. I don't know. At any rate, I don't feel the emotion of love for you. No, and I don't want to, because it gives out in the last issues." "Love gives out in the last issues?" she asked, feeling numb to the lips. "Yes, it does. At the very last, one is alone, beyond the influence of love. There is a real impersonal me that is beyond love, beyond any emotional relationship. So it is with you. But we want to delude ourselves that love is the root. It isn't. It is only the branches. The root is beyond love, a naked kind of isolation, an isolated me that does not meet and mingle and never can." She watched him with wide, troubled eyes. His face was incandescent in its abstract earnestness. "And you mean you can't love?" she asked in trepidation. "Yes, if you like. I have loved, but there is a beyond, where there is not love." She could not submit to this. She felt it swooning over her, but she could not submit. "But how do you know if you have never really loved?" she asked. "It is true, what I say. There is a beyond in you, in me, which is further than love, beyond the scope, as stars are beyond the scope of vision, some of them." "Then there is no love," cried Ursula. "Ultimately, no, there is something else. But ultimately, there is no love." Ursula was given over to this statement for some moments. Then she half rose from her chair, saying, in a final, repellent voice, "Then let me go home." "What am I doing here?" "There is the door," he said. "You are a free agent." He was suspended finely and perfectly in this extremity. She hung motionless for some seconds, then she sat down again. "If there is no love, what is there?" she cried, almost jeering. "Something," he said, looking at her, battling with his soul, with all his might. "What?" He was silent for a long time, unable to be in communication with her while she was in this state of opposition. "There is," he said, in a voice of pure abstraction, "a final me which is stark and impersonal and beyond responsibility. So there is a final you, and it is there I would want to meet you, not in the emotional, loving plane, but there beyond, where there is no speech and no terms of agreement. There we are two stark, unknown beings, two utterly strange creatures. I would want to approach you, and you me. And there could be no obligation because there is no standard for action there, because no understanding has been reaped from that plane. It is quite inhuman, so there can be no calling to book in any form whatsoever, because one is outside the pale of all that is accepted, and nothing known applies. One can only follow the impulse, taking that which lies in front, and responsible for nothing, asked for nothing, giving nothing, only each taking according to the primal desire. Ursula listened to this speech, her mind dumb and almost senseless. What he said was so unexpected and so untoward. It is just purely selfish, she said. If it is pure, yes. But it isn't selfish at all. Because I don't know what I want of you. I deliver myself over to the unknown. In coming to you, I am without reserves or defenses, stripped entirely into the unknown. Only there needs the pledge between us that we will both cast off everything, cast off ourselves even, and cease to be, so that that which is perfectly ourselves can take place in us. She pondered along her own line of thought. But it is because you love me that you want me, she persisted. No, it isn't. It is because I believe in you if I do believe in you. Aren't you sure? She laughed, suddenly hurt. He was looking at her steadfastly, scarcely heeding what she said. Yes, I must believe in you, or else I shouldn't be here saying this, he replied. But that is all the proof I have. I don't feel any very strong belief at this particular moment. She disliked him for this sudden relapse into weariness and faithlessness. But don't you think me good-looking? She persisted in a mocking voice. He looked at her to see if he felt that she was good-looking. I don't feel that you're good-looking, he said. Not even attractive? She mocked, bitingly. He knitted his brows in sudden exasperation. Don't you see that it's not a question of visual appreciation in the least, he cried. I don't want to see you. I've seen plenty of women. I'm sick and weary of seeing them. I want a woman I don't see. I'm sorry I can't oblige you by being invisible, she laughed. Yes, he said, you are invisible to me, if you don't force me to be visually aware of you. But I don't want to see you or hear you. What did you ask me to tea for then? She mocked. But he would take no notice of her. He was talking to himself. I want to find you, where you don't know your own existence, the you that your common self denies utterly. But I don't want your good looks, and I don't want your womanly feelings, and I don't want your thoughts, nor opinions, nor your ideas. They are all bagatelles to me. You are very conceited, monsieur, she mocked. How do you know what my womanly feelings are, or my thoughts, or my ideas? You don't even know what I think of you now. Nor do I care in the slightest. I think you are very silly. I think you want to tell me you love me, and you go all this way round to do it. All right, he said, looking up with sudden exasperation. Now go away then and leave me alone. I don't want any more of your meretricious persiflage. Is it really persiflage? She mocked, her face really relaxing into laughter. She interpreted it that he had made a deep confession of love to her. But he was so absurd in his words also. They were silent for many minutes. She was pleased and elated like a child. His concentration broke. He began to look at her simply and naturally. What I want is a strange conjunction with you, he said quietly. Not meeting and mingling. You are quite right, but an equilibrium, a pure balance of two single beings, as the stars balance each other. She looked at him. He was very earnest, and earnestness was always rather ridiculous, commonplace to her. It made her feel unfree and uncomfortable, yet she liked him so much. But why drag in the stars? Isn't this rather sudden? She mocked. He began to laugh. Best to read the terms of the contract before we sign, he said. A young gray cat that had been sleeping on the sofa jumped down and stretched, rising on its long legs and arching its slim back. Then it sat considering for a moment, erect and kingly. And then, like a dart, it had shot out of the room, through the open window doors and into the garden. What's he after? Said Birkin, rising. The young cat trotted lordly down the path, waving his tail. He was an ordinary tabby with white paws, a slender young gentleman. A crouching, fluffy, brownish-gray cat was stealing up the side of the fence. The Minnow walked statelily up to her, with manly nonchalance. She crouched before him and pressed herself on the ground in humility, a fluffy, soft outcast, looking up at him with wild eyes that were green and lovely as great jewels. He looked casually down on her, so she crept a few inches further, proceeding on her way to the back door, crouching in a wonderful, soft, self-obliterating manner and moving like a shadow. He, going statelily on his slim legs, walked after her. Then suddenly, for pure excess, he gave her a light cuff with his paw on the side of her face. She ran off a few steps, like a blown leaf along the ground, then crouched unobtrusively in submissive, wild patience. The Minnow pretended to take no notice of her. He blinked his eyes superbly at the landscape. In a minute, she drew herself together and moved softly, a fleecy brown-gray shadow, a few paces forward. She began to quicken her pace. In a moment, she would be gone like a dream, when the young gray lord sprang before her and gave her a light, handsome cuff. She subsided at once, submissively. "She is a wild cat," said Birkin. "She has come in from the woods." The eyes of the stray cat flared round for a moment, like great green fires staring at Birkin. Then she had rushed in a soft, swift rush, halfway down the garden. There she paused to look round. The Minnow turned his face in pure superiority to his master and slowly closed his eyes, standing in statuesque young perfection. The wild cat's round, green, wondering eyes were staring all the while like uncanny fires. Then again, like a shadow, she slid towards the kitchen. In a lovely springing leap, like a wind, the Minnow was upon her and had boxed her twice, very definitely, with a white, delicate fist. She sank and slid back, unquestioning. He walked after her and cuffed her once or twice, leisurely, with sudden little blows of his magic white paws. "Now, why does he do that?" cried Ursula in indignation. "They are on intimate terms," said Birkin. "And is that why he hits her?" "Yes," laughed Birkin. "I think he wants to make it quite obvious to her." "Isn't it horrid of him?" she cried, and going out into the garden, she called to the Minnow. "Stop it, don't bully. Stop hitting her." The stray cat vanished like a swift, invisible shadow. The Minnow glanced at Ursula, then looked from her disdainfully to his master. "Are you a bully, Minnow?" Birkin asked. The young slim cat looked at him and slowly narrowed its eyes. Then it glanced away at the landscape, looking into the distance as if completely oblivious of the two human beings. "Minnow," said Ursula, "I don't like you. You are a bully like all males." "No," said Birkin. "He is justified. He is not a bully. He is only insisting to the poor stray that she shall acknowledge him as a sort of fate, her own fate, because you can see she is fluffy and promiscuous as the wind. I am with him entirely. He wants superfine stability." "Yes, I know," cried Ursula. "He wants his own way. I know what your fine words work down to. Bossiness. I call it bossiness." The young cat again glanced at Birkin in disdain of the noisy woman. "I quite agree with you, Misiato," said Birkin to the cat. "Keep your male dignity and your higher understanding." Again the Minnow narrowed his eyes, as if he were looking at the sun. Then, suddenly affecting to have no connection at all with the two people, he went trotting off, with assumed spontaneity and gaiety, his tail erect, his white feet blithe. Now he will find the belle savage once more, and entertain her with his superior wisdom, laughed Birkin. Ursula looked at the man who stood in the garden with his hair blowing and his eyes smiling ironically, and she cried, "Oh, it makes me so cross, this assumption of male superiority. And it is such a lie. One wouldn't mind if there were any justification for it." "The wild cat," said Birkin, "doesn't mind. She perceives that it is justified." "Does she?" cried Ursula. "And tell it to the horse marines. To them also. It is just like Gerald Critch with his horse, a lust for bullying, a real Will Zurmacht, so base, so petty." "I agree that the Will Zurmacht is a base and petty thing, but with the Minnow, it is the desire to bring this female cat into a pure stable equilibrium, a transcendent and abiding rapport with the single male. Whereas without him, as you see, she is a mere stray, a fluffy, sporadic bit of chaos. It is a volant de pouvoir, if you like, a will to ability, taking pouvoir as a verb. Ah, sophistries. It's the old Adam. Oh yes, Adam kept Eve in the indestructible paradise when he kept her single with himself, like a star in its orbit. Yes, yes, cried Ursula, pointing her finger at him. There you are, a star in its orbit. A satellite of Mars. That's what she is to be. There, you've given yourself away. You want a satellite, Mars, and his satellite. You've said it, you've dished yourself. He stood smiling in frustration and amusement and irritation and admiration and love. She was so quick and so lambent, like discernible fire, and so vindictive and so rich in her dangerous, flamy sensitiveness. I've not said it at all, he replied, if you will give me a chance to speak. No, she cried. I won't let you speak. You've said it, a satellite, you're not going to wriggle out of it. You've said it. You'll never believe now that I haven't said it, he answered. I neither implied nor indicated nor mentioned a satellite, nor intended a satellite, never. You prevaricator, she cried, in real indignation. Tea is ready, sir, said the landlady from the doorway. They both looked at her, very much as the cats had looked at them, a little while before. Thank you, Mrs. Dakin. An interrupted silence fell over the two of them, a moment of breach. Come and have tea, he said. Yes, I should love it, she replied, gathering herself together. They sat facing each other across the tea table. I did not say, nor imply, a satellite. I meant two single equal stars balanced in conjunction. You gave yourself away. You gave away your little game completely, she cried, beginning at once to eat. He saw that she would take no further heed of his expostulation, so he began to pour the tea. What good things to eat, she cried. Take your own sugar, he said. He handed her cup. He had everything so nice, such pretty cups and plates, painted with mauve luster and green, also shapely bowls and glass plates and old spoons on a woven cloth of pale gray and black and purple. It was very rich and fine, but Ursula could see her Mayonnaise influence. Your things are so lovely, she said, almost angrily. I like them. It gives me real pleasure to use things that are attractive in themselves, pleasant things. And Mrs. Dakin is good. She thinks everything is wonderful for my sake. Really, said Ursula, landladies are better than wives nowadays. They certainly care a great deal more. It is much more beautiful and complete here now than if you were married. But think of the emptiness within, he laughed. No, she said. I am jealous that men have such perfect landladies and such beautiful lodgings. There is nothing left them to desire. In the housekeeping way, we'll hope not. It is disgusting, people marrying for a home. Still, said Ursula, a man has very little need for a woman now, has he? In outer things, maybe, except to share his bed and bear his children. But essentially, there is just the same need as there ever was. Only nobody takes the trouble to be essential. How essential, she said. I do think, he said, that the world is only held together by the mystic conjunction, the ultimate unison between people, a bond. And the immediate bond is between man and woman. But it's such old hat, said Ursula. Why should love be a bond? No, I'm not having any. If you are walking westward, he said, you forfeit the northern and eastward and southern direction. If you admit a unison, you forfeit all the possibilities of chaos. But love is freedom, she declared. Don't cant to me, he replied. Love is a direction which excludes all other directions. It's a freedom together, if you like. No, she said. Love includes everything. Sentimental can't, he replied. You want the state of chaos, that's all. It is ultimate nihilism, this freedom and love business, this freedom which is love and love which is freedom. As a matter of fact, if you enter into a pure unison, it is irrevocable, and it is never pure till it is irrevocable. And when it is irrevocable, it is one way, like the path of a star. Ha, she cried bitterly. It is the old, dead morality. No, he said. It is the law of creation. One is committed. One must commit oneself to a conjunction with the other, forever. But it is not selfless. It is a maintaining of the self in mystic balance and integrity, like a star balanced with another star. I don't trust you when you drag in the stars, she said. If you were quite true, it wouldn't be necessary to be so far-fetched. Don't trust me then, he said, angry. It is enough that I trust myself. And that is where you make another mistake, she replied. You don't trust yourself. You don't fully believe yourself, what you are saying. You don't really want this conjunction. Otherwise, you wouldn't talk so much about it, you'd get it. He was suspended for a moment, arrested.
How? He said.
By just loving, she retorted in defiance. He was still a moment in anger. Then he said, I tell you, I don't believe in love like that. I tell you, you want love to administer to your egoism, to subserve you. Love is a process of subservience with you, and with everybody. I hate it. No, she cried, pressing back her head like a cobra, her eyes flashing. It is a process of pride. I want to be proud. Proud and subservient, I know you, he retorted dryly. Proud and subservient, then subservient to the proud. I know you and your love. It is a tic-tac, a dance of opposites. Are you sure, she mocked wickedly, what my love is? Yes, I am, he retorted. So cocksure, she said. How can anybody ever be right who is so cocksure? It shows you are wrong. He was silent in chagrin. They had talked and struggled till they were both wearied out. Tell me about yourself and your people, he said. And she told him about the Brangwens and about her mother and about Skrabensky, her first love, and about her later experiences. He sat very still, watching her as she talked, and he seemed to listen with reverence. Her face was beautiful and full of baffled light as she told him all the things that had hurt her or perplexed her so deeply. He seemed to warm and comfort his soul at the beautiful light of her nature. If she really could pledge herself, he thought to himself, with passionate insistence, but hardly any hope. Yet a curious little irresponsible laughter appeared in his heart. We have all suffered so much, he mocked ironically. She looked up at him, and a flash of wild gaiety went over her face, a strange flash of yellow light coming from her eyes. Haven't we? She cried, in a high, reckless cry. It is almost absurd, isn't it? Quite absurd, he said. Suffering bores me anymore. So, it does me. He was almost afraid of the mocking recklessness of her splendid face. Here was one who would go to the whole lengths of heaven or hell, whichever she had to go. And he mistrusted her. He was afraid of a woman capable of such abandon, such dangerous thoroughness of destructivity. Yet he chuckled within himself also. She came over to him and put her hand on his shoulder, looking down at him with strange golden-lighted eyes, very tender, but with a curious devilish look lurking underneath. Say you love me, say my love to me, she pleaded. He looked back into her eyes and saw. His face flickered with sardonic comprehension. I love you right enough, he said grimly, but I want it to be something else. But why? But why? She insisted, bending her wonderful luminous face to him. Why isn't it enough? Because we can go one better, he said, putting his arms round her. No, we can't, she said in a strong, voluptuous voice of yielding. We can only love each other. Say my love to me. Say it, say it. She put her arms round his neck. He enfolded her and kissed her subtly, murmuring in a subtle voice of love and irony and submission. Yes, my love. Yes, my love. Let love be enough then. I love you then, I love you.
I'm bored by the rest.
Yes, she murmured, nestling very sweet and close to him. 14. Water party. Every year, Mr. Critch gave a more or less public water party on the lake. There was a little pleasure launch on Wiley Water and several rowing boats, and guests could take tea either in the marquee that was set up in the grounds of the house, or they could picnic in the shade of the great walnut tree at the boathouse by the lake. This year the staff of the grammar school was invited, along with the chief officials of the firm. Gerald and the younger Krishes did not care for this party, but it had become customary now, and it pleased the father, as being the only occasion when he could gather some people of the district together in festivity with him. For he loved to give pleasures to his dependents and to those poorer than himself. But his children preferred the company of their own equals in wealth. They hated their inferiors' humility or gratitude or awkwardness. Nevertheless, they were willing to attend at this festival, as they had done almost since they were children, the more so, as they all felt a little guilty now and unwilling to thwart their father anymore, since he was so ill in health. Therefore, quite cheerfully Laura prepared to take her mother's place as hostess, and Gerald assumed responsibility for the amusements on the water. Boken had written to Ursula saying he expected to see her at the party, and Gudrun, although she scorned the patronage of the Krishes, would nevertheless accompany her mother and father, if the weather were fine. The day came blue and full of sunshine, with little wafts of wind. The sisters both wore dresses of white crepe and hats of soft grass. But Gudrun had a sash of brilliant black and pink and yellow color wound broadly round her waist, and she had pink silk stockings and black and pink and yellow decoration on the brim of her hat, weighing it down a little. She carried also a yellow silk coat over her arm, so that she looked remarkable, like a painting from the salon. Her appearance was a sore trial to her father, who said angrily, "Don't you think you might as well get yourself up for a Christmas cracker, and ha done with it?" But Gudrun looked handsome and brilliant, and she wore her clothes in pure defiance. When people stared at her and giggled after her, she made a point of saying loudly to Ursula,
Regarde ces gens-là. Ne sont-ils pas des hiboux incroyables?
And with the words of French in her mouth, she would look over her shoulder at the giggling party. "No, really, it's impossible," Ursula would reply distinctly. And so the two girls took it out of their universal enemy. But their father became more and more enraged. Ursula was all snowy white, save that her hat was pink and entirely without trimming, and her shoes were dark red, and she carried an orange-colored coat. And in this guise they were walking all the way to Shortlands, their father and mother going in front. They were laughing at their mother, who, dressed in a summer material of black and purple stripes and wearing a hat of purple straw, was setting forth with much more of the shyness and trepidation of a young girl than her daughters ever felt, walking demurely beside her husband, who, as usual, looked rather crumpled in his best suit, as if he were the father of a young family and had been holding the baby whilst his wife got dressed. "Look at the young couple in front," said Gudrun calmly. Ursula looked at her mother and father and was suddenly seized with uncontrollable laughter. The two girls stood in the road and laughed till the tears ran down their faces as they caught sight again of the shy, unworldly couple of their parents going on ahead. "We are roaring at you, mother," called Ursula, helplessly following after her parents. Mrs. Brangwen turned round with a slightly puzzled, exasperated look. "Oh, indeed," she said. "What is there so very funny about me? I should like to know." She could not understand that there could be anything amiss with her appearance. She had a perfect calm sufficiency, an easy indifference to any criticism whatsoever, as if she were beyond it. Her clothes were always rather odd, and as a rule slipshod, yet she wore them with a perfect ease and satisfaction. Whatever she had on, so long as she was barely tidy, she was right, beyond remark. Such an aristocrat she was by instinct. "You look so stately, like a country baroness," said Ursula, laughing with a little tenderness at her mother's naive, puzzled air. "Just like a country baroness," chimed in Gudrun. Now the mother's natural hauteur became self-conscious, and the girls shrieked again. "Go home, you pair of idiots, great giggling idiots," cried the father, inflamed with irritation. Booed Ursula, pulling a face at his crossness. The yellow lights danced in his eyes. He leaned forward in real rage. "Don't be so silly as to take any notice of the great Gabbies," said Mrs. Brangwen, turning on her way. "I'll see if I'm going to be followed by a pair of giggling, yelling jackanapes," he cried vengefully. The girls stood still, laughing helplessly at his fury, upon the path beside the hedge. "Why are as silly as they are to take any notice?" said Mrs. Brangwen, also becoming angry now he was really enraged. "There are some people coming, father," cried Ursula, with mocking warning. He glanced round quickly and went on to join his wife, walking stiff with rage. And the girls followed, weak with laughter. When the people had passed by, Brangwen cried in a loud, stupid voice, "I'm going back home if there's any more of this. I'm damned if I'm going to be made a fool of in this fashion, in the public road." He was really out of temper. At the sound of his blind, vindictive voice, the laughter suddenly left the girls, and their hearts contracted with contempt. They hated his words, "in the public road." What did they care for the public road? But Gudrun was conciliatory. "But we weren't laughing to hurt you," she cried, with an uncouth gentleness which made her parents uncomfortable. "We were laughing because we're fond of you. We'll walk on in front, if they are so touchy," said Ursula, angry. And in this wise they arrived at Wily Water. The lake was blue and fair. The meadows sloped down in sunshine on one side. The thick dark woods dropped steeply on the other. The little pleasure launch was fussing out from the shore, twanging its music, crowded with people, flapping its paddles. Near the boathouse was a throng of gaily dressed persons, small in the distance. And on the highroad, some of the common people were standing along the hedge, looking at the festivity beyond, enviously, like souls not admitted to paradise. "My eye," said Gudrun, sotto voce, looking at the motley of guests. "There's a pretty crowd if you like. Imagine yourself in the midst of that, my dear." Gudrun's apprehensive horror of people in the mass unnerved Ursula. "It looks rather awful," she said anxiously. "And imagine what they'll be like." "Imagine," said Gudrun, still in that unnerving, subdued voice. Yet she advanced determinedly. "I suppose we can get away from them," said Ursula anxiously. "We're in a pretty fix if we can't," said Gudrun. Her extreme ironic loathing and apprehension was very trying to Ursula. "We needn't stay," she said. "I certainly shan't stay 5 minutes among that little lot," said Gudrun. They advanced nearer, till they saw policemen at the gates. "Policemen to keep you in, too," said Gudrun. "My word, this is a beautiful affair." "We'd better look after father and mother," said Ursula anxiously. "Mother's perfectly capable of getting through this little celebration," said Gudrun with some contempt. But Ursula knew that her father felt uncouth and angry and unhappy, so she was far from her ease. They waited outside the gate till their parents came up. The tall, thin man in his crumpled clothes was unnerved and irritable as a boy, finding himself on the brink of this social function. He did not feel a gentleman. He did not feel anything except pure exasperation. Ursula took her place at his side. They gave their tickets to the policeman and passed in onto the grass, for abreast, the tall, hot, ruddy dark man with his narrow boyish brow drawn with irritation, the fresh-faced, easy woman, perfectly collected though her hair was slipping on one side, then Gudrun, her eyes round and dark and staring, her full soft face impassive, almost sulky, so that she seemed to be backing away in antagonism even whilst she was advancing, and then Ursula with the odd, brilliant, dazzled look on her face that always came when she was in some false situation. Birkin was the good angel. He came smiling to them with his affected social grace that somehow was never quite right. But he took off his hat and smiled at them with a real smile in his eyes, so that Brangwen cried out heartily in relief. "How do you do? You're better, are you?" "Yes, I'm better." "How do you do, Mrs. Brangwen? I know Gudrun and Ursula very well." His eyes smiled full of natural warmth. He had a soft, flattering manner with women, particularly with women who were not young. "Yes," said Mrs. Brangwen, cool but yet gratified. "I have heard them speak of you often enough." He laughed. Gudrun looked aside, feeling she was being belittled. People were standing about in groups. Some women were sitting in the shade of the walnut tree, with cups of tea in their hands. A waiter in evening dress was hurrying round. Some girls were simpering with parasols. Some young men, who had just come in from rowing, were sitting cross-legged on the grass, coatless, their shirt sleeves rolled up in manly fashion, their hands resting on their white flannel trousers, their gaudy ties floating about, as they laughed and tried to be witty with the young damsels. "Why," thought Gudrun churlishly, "don't they have the manners to put their coats on and not to assume such intimacy in their appearance. She abhorred the ordinary young man, with his hair plastered back and his easygoing chumminess. Hermione Rawdice came up in a handsome gown of white lace, trailing an enormous silk shawl blotched with great embroidered flowers and balancing an enormous plain hat on her head. She looked striking, astonishing, almost macabre, so tall, with the fringe of her great cream-colored, vividly blotched shawl trailing on the ground after her, her thick hair coming low over her eyes, her face strange and long and pale, and the blotches of brilliant color drawn round her. "Doesn't she look weird?" Gudrun heard some girls titter behind her, and she could have killed them. "How do you do?" sang Hermione, coming up very kindly and glancing slowly over Gudrun's father and mother. It was a trying moment, exasperating for Gudrun. Hermione was really so strongly entrenched in her class superiority. She could come up and know people out of simple curiosity, as if they were creatures on exhibition. Gudrun would do the same herself, but she resented being in the position when somebody might do it to her. Hermione, very remarkable, and distinguishing the Brangwens very much, led them along to where Laura Critch stood receiving the guests. "This is Mrs. Brangwen," sang Hermione, and Laura, who wore a stiff embroidered linen dress, shook hands and said she was glad to see her. Then Gerald came up, dressed in white, with a black and brown blazer, and looking handsome. He too was introduced to the Brangwen parents, and immediately he spoke to Mrs. Brangwen as if she were a lady, and to Brangwen as if he were not a gentleman. Gerald was so obvious in his demeanor. He had to shake hands with his left hand, because he had hurt his right, and carried it, bandaged up, in the pocket of his jacket. Gudrun was very thankful that none of her party asked him what was the matter with the hand. The steam launch was fussing in, all its music jingling, people calling excitedly from on board. Gerald went to see to the debarkation. Birkin was getting tea for Mrs. Brangwen. Brangwen had joined a grammar school group. Hermione was sitting down by their mother. The girls went to the landing stage to watch the launch come in. She hooted and tooted gaily. Then her paddles were silent. The ropes were thrown ashore. She drifted in with a little bump. Immediately the passengers crowded excitedly to come ashore. Wait a minute, shouted Gerald in sharp command. They must wait till the boat was tight on the ropes, till the small gangway was put out. Then they streamed ashore, clamoring as if they had come from America. "Oh, it's so nice," the young girls were crying. "It's quite lovely." The waiters from on board ran out to the boathouse with baskets. The captain lounged on the little bridge. Seeing all safe, Gerald came to Gudrun and Ursula. "You wouldn't care to go on board for the next trip and have tea there?" he asked. "No thanks," said Gudrun coldly. "You don't care for the water?" "For the water? Yes, I like it very much." He looked at her, his eyes searching. "You don't care for going on a launch, then?" She was slow in answering, and then she spoke slowly. "No," she said. "I can't say that I do." Her color was high. She seemed angry about something.
Un peu trop de monde, said Ursula, explaining. Trop de monde.
He laughed shortly. "Yes, there's a fair number of Gudrun turned on him brilliantly. "Have you ever been from Westminster Bridge to Richmond on one of the Thames steamers?" she cried. "No," he said. "I can't say I have." "Well, it's one of the most vile experiences I've ever had." She spoke rapidly and excitedly, the color high in her cheeks. There was absolutely nowhere to sit down, nowhere. A man just above sang, rocked in the cradle of the deep the whole way. He was blind and he had a small organ, one of those portable organs, and he expected money. So you can imagine what that was like. There came a constant smell of luncheon from below and puffs of hot, oily machinery. The journey took hours and hours and hours, and for miles, literally for miles, dreadful boys ran with us on the shore, in that awful Thames mud, going in up, to the waist. They had their trousers turned back, and they went up to their hips in that indescribable Thames mud, their faces always turned to us, and screaming, exactly like carrion creatures screaming, "Air wire, sir! Air wire, sir! Air wire, sir!" Exactly like some foul carrion objects, perfectly obscene, and paterfamilias on board, laughing when the boys went right down in that awful mud, occasionally throwing them a ha'penny. And if you'd seen the intent look on the faces of these boys, and the way they darted in the filth when a coin was flung, really, no vulture or jackal could dream of approaching them for foulness.
I
Never would go on a pleasure boat again, never. Gerald watched her all the time she spoke, his eyes glittering with faint rousedness. It was not so much what she said, it was she herself who roused him with a small, vivid pricking. Of course, he said, every civilized body is bound to have its vermin. Why, cried Ursula, I don't have vermin. And it's not that, it's the quality of the whole thing. Paterfamilias laughing and thinking it sport, and throwing the ha'pennies, and materfamilias spreading her fat little knees and eating, continually eating, replied Gudrun. Yes, said Ursula. It isn't the boys so much who are vermin. It's the people themselves, the whole body politic, as you call it. Gerald laughed. Never mind, he said. You shan't go on the launch. Gudrun flushed quickly at his rebuke. There were a few moments of silence. Gerald, like a sentinel, was watching the people who were going on to the boat. He was very good-looking and self-contained, but his air of soldierly alertness was rather irritating. Will you have tea here then, or go across to the house, where there's a tent on the lawn? He asked. Can't we have a rowing boat and get out? Asked Ursula, who was always rushing in too fast. To get out? Smiled Gerald. You see, cried Gudrun, flushing at Ursula's outspoken rudeness. We don't know the people. We are almost complete strangers here. Oh, I can soon set you up with a few acquaintances, he said easily. Gudrun looked at him to see if it were ill-meant. Then she smiled at him. Ah, she said, you know what we mean. Can't we go up there and explore that coast? She pointed to a grove on the hillock of the meadowside, near the shore halfway down the lake. That looks perfectly lovely. We might even bathe. Isn't it beautiful in this light? Really, it's like one of the reaches of the Nile as one imagines the Nile. Gerald smiled at her factitious enthusiasm for the distant spot. You're sure it's far enough off? He asked ironically, adding at once. Yes, you might go there if we could get a boat. They seem to be all out. He looked round the lake and counted the rowing boats on its surface. How lovely it would be, cried Ursula wistfully. And don't you want tea? He said. Oh, said Gudrun. We could just drink a cup and be off. He looked from one to the other, smiling. He was somewhat offended, yet sporting. Can you manage a boat pretty well? He asked. Yes, replied Gudrun coldly. Pretty well. Oh yes, cried Ursula. We can both of us row like water spiders. You can? There's a light little canoe of mine that I didn't take out for fear somebody should drown themselves. Do you think you'd be safe in that? Oh, perfectly, said Gudrun. What an angel, cried Ursula. Don't, for my sake, have an accident, because I'm responsible for the water. Sure, pledged Gudrun. Besides, we can both swim quite well, said Ursula. Well, then I'll get them to put you up a tea basket, and you can picnic all to yourselves. That's the idea, isn't it? How fearfully good. How frightfully nice if you could, cried Gudrun warmly, her color flushing up again. It made the blood stir in his veins, the subtle way she turned to him and infused her gratitude into his body. Where's Birkin? He said, his eyes twinkling. He might help me to get it down. But what about your hand? Isn't it hurt? Asked Gudrun, rather muted, as if avoiding the intimacy. This was the first time the hurt had been mentioned. The curious way she skirted round the subject sent a new, subtle caress through his veins. He took his hand out of his pocket. It was bandaged. He looked at it, then put it in his pocket again. Gudrun quivered at the sight of the wrapped-up paw. Oh, I can manage, with one hand. The canoe is as light as a feather, he said. There's Rupert. Rupert. Birkin turned from his social duties and came towards them. What have you done to it? Asked Ursula, who had been aching to put the question for the last half hour. To my hand, said Gerald. I trapped it in some machinery. Ugh, said Ursula. And did it hurt much? Yes, he said. It did at the time. It's getting better now. It crushed the fingers. "Oh," cried Ursula, as if in pain. "I hate people who hurt themselves. I can feel it." And she shook her hand. "What do you want?" said Birkin. The two men carried down the slim brown boat and set it on the water. "You're quite sure you'll be safe in it?"